I was sentenced to live, just long enough to fail properly. They brought me up from the holding pits under Precinct Kappa 9, with my wrists bound in iron and my name bound in parchment. The cage lifts rattled as they climbed, each jolting stop a reminder that the hive itself was an execution engine with 1,000 slow gears. Above, the air changed from sour sweat and sump mold to the sharper sting of incense burned to cover old blood. When the doors opened, lumen strips stabbed my eyes, and the Imperial Aquila watched from every wall panel, its wings stretched across riveted plasteel like it could pin a man in place. The chapel was not a chapel in any honest sense. It had no sky and no silence. It was a corridor widened into ceremony, a place built for processing bodies the way the Manufactorum processed ore, measure, stamp, move on. A lectern of blackened steel stood under a vox horn that hissed with static, and behind it a banner hung in strips, stained with promethium smoke and the oily fingerprints of hands that had begged beneath it. An ecclesiarchy priest waited there, thin as a wire, his face rubbed raw by devotion and recycled air. An Arbite sergeant stood to his left in carapace plates that had seen too many riots. A Militarum clerk stood to his right with a data slate pressed to his chest like a shield. I knew why I was there. I had already confessed the facts in a tin cell that smelled of disinfectant and fear. I had abandoned my squad when the tunnel collapsed and the lumen went out and the screams became muffled by falling ferrocrete. I had crawled through a maintenance vent with my lungs burning and my mind empty of orders, and I had surfaced hours later among the ration queues, alive, filthy, and alone. There had been no triumph in that survival. It had felt like stealing. The commissariat did not tolerate thieves. The priest began without greeting, because greeting implies equality. The vox horn amplified him into something larger than flesh. By the grace of him on terra, whose light is law, whose silence is judgment, the bearer of this designation stands condemned. The Militarum clerk lifted the data slate, and I heard my identification read like a serial number on a crate. Trooper 2nd Class Joran Val, 117th Harkane Line, currently attached to HIV Defense Detachment Theta. I had not heard my full name spoken aloud in weeks. It sounded like a stranger's. The Arbite sergeant produced a sheet of vellum with a red seal. He held it so the Aquila stamp faced me, as if the symbol could force obedience out of bone. Executioners granted, the vox horn declared, but mercy is denied. The words did not land cleanly. Mercy is denied was a phrase I expected. Execution is granted was the inversion that made my stomach drop, because it suggested I was being given a privilege. The priest continued, voice steady as a metronome. The condemned is assigned to penitent detail, delay pattern 9. A living measure, a breathing barricade. A minute purchased at the price of flesh. I looked at the clerk's slate, and for a moment I imagined it as a mirror. A man reduced to tally marks. A man whose value had been recalculated. The Militarum loved numbers because numbers did not beg. Numbers did not weep. Numbers did not remember faces under helmets. Numbers could be written and erased. The Arbite sergeant turned the vellum, so I could see the lines already filled. My designation, my unit, the date, the location stamp of Precinct Kappa 9. At the bottom there was a blank space for my thumbprint, and beneath that a second seal wax circle waiting to be pressed. Consent, they called it. A man had to agree to die in the specific way they needed him to die. They made it ritual so it could be called choice. My mouth tasted of iron. I had bitten my tongue in the lift without realizing. I tried to swallow and felt the dryness scrape my throat. The priest watched me, his eyes bright with a kind of calm that terrified me more than anger. He did not hate me. He needed me. Hatred would have been a luxury. Understand, the vox horn said, and the word understand carried the weight of command. The hive's spine is compromised. Transit arteries are under breach. Civilians are to be evacuated to the upper levels. Ammunition sanctums are to be sealed. Command requires time. You will provide time. Behind the priest, an open arch led into a passage where servitors moved, dragging bundles and crates. Their faces were half gone, replaced by augmetic plates and vox grills that exhaled steam. One of them turned its head toward me as it passed, and in the brief alignment of its remaining eye, I saw something like recognition, and then nothing. A human thought extinguished to make room for function. I wondered if that was what this sentence offered me, a path from shame into usefulness, from failure into mechanism. The Arbeit sergeant extended the vellum and the ink pad. The ink was thick, black, oily, smelling faintly of machine lubricant. I stared at the blank space where my thumb would go as if it were a wound waiting to be opened. I could refuse, they had said in the cell. Refusal meant a quick shot. Refusal meant my body returned to the grinder with no delay purchased, no minutes earned, no worth reclaimed. I had imagined myself refusing out of spite, just to prove that I still owned something. Then I had imagined the faces of my squad, Kessel with his broken teeth, Mara with her rosary wound around her rifle stock, and I had realized I did not deserve spite. I deserved payment. I pressed my thumb into the ink. It coated my skin like tar. When I pressed it to the vellum, it left a dark oval that looked like an eye. The clerk's stylus clicked, recording the confirmation. The priest lifted his hands as if blessing me, but his blessing was cold and formal. The emperor receives all debts, the vox horn intoned. You will be counted. They took my cuffs off only to replace them. A new restraint, lighter, fitted to my forearms, stamped with the sigil of the Militarum. They were not shackles for a prisoner, they were safety restraints for a piece of equipment. They gave me a flak coat, without unit patches. They removed my dog tags and put them in a sealed pouch for later processing. The Arbeit sergeant handed me a lasgun with the power pack already fitted and sealed. You will not remove the pack, he said through his helm's vox grill. It was the first direct human voice I had heard in the room, and it sounded tired. A servo skull floated down from an alcove, its candles guttering. It projected a dull green hollow in the air, a schematic of a corridor lattice, marked with numbers and arrows. Delay pattern 9. The hive rendered into lines. My death rendered into stages. Each stage a position to hold until ordered to fall back. Each stage a gate to seal or a charge to trigger. The priest recited the litany of assignment, naming each point as if it were a saint. Choke 1, the St. Helix Transit Arch. Choke 2, the Manufactorum Vent Spine. Choke 3, the Shrine of the 49th Martyr. Final seal, Vault Kappa 12. I listened, and something inside me rearranged itself. Fear did not leave. Fear became structured. The unknown shape of death became a map with waypoints. I could hate a bullet because it was random. I could accept a map because it offered purpose. They marched me out through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and hot metal. The hive's lower precinct levels were lit by failing lumens, flickering like nervous eyelids. I passed cells where other condemned men watched through bars, their faces grey in the half-light. Some spat at me. Some made the sign of the Aquila. One laughed, and then coughed until blood spotted the floor. The laughter followed me like a curse. At the armory door, a tech adept waited with a small auspex and an ointment jar. His robe was stained with unguents, his augmetic fingers clicking softly. He did not speak in words at first. He pressed the auspex to my new restraints, and it chirped in binaric cant. He dabbed ointment on the stamped sigils, as if feeding a machine spirit. Then, in a voice like grinding gears, he said, "Function confirmed. Delay unit prepared. Delay unit. Not trooper. Not man." I wanted to protest. I wanted to insist on my name. The sound died in my throat. The hive did not care what I wanted. The Imperium did not care what I was called. It cared what I did before I stopped doing. They led me into an elevator cage meant for cargo. The floor was slick with oil. A crate of frag grenades sat chained in the corner with a wax seal. Above it, painted in red, were the words, "Property of the Militarum." The Arbeit sergeant closed the gate and signaled. The cage began to descend, deeper into the hive's throat. The air grew warmer, heavier, tasting of promethium, and the faint sweetness of decay. The further down we went, the more the hive sounded alive, pipes rattling, distant chanting, the hiss of venting steam, the occasional muffled boom of artillery echoing through the structure like a heartbeat. The vox in my ear clicked to life. Not a friendly channel, not the chatter of comrades. A cold broadcast tone. Delay Unit Val. Acknowledge. The voice was a woman's, clipped and formal, a Militarum controller. I pressed the stud on my collar. Acknowledged. You have been assigned to delay pattern 9, she said, as if the vellum and the chapel had not already branded it into me. You will receive timed orders. You will comply. You will not improvise beyond instructed parameters unless direct contact is lost. Your purpose is temporal acquisition. Do you understand? Temporal acquisition. They spoke of time like it was ammunition. I thought of hours spent on the line, waiting for orders that never came, and of the way time had felt infinite then. Now, time was a ration. Now, time was measured in my breaths. I understand, I answered. The cage shuddered to a stop. The gate opened. The heat rolled in like a living thing. The corridor beyond was lit by emergency lumens, red and dim, making the walls look wet. Far away, something screamed, metal or human, I could not tell. The Arbeit sergeant gestured me forward with his shotgun. The priest was gone. The chapel was gone. The ceremony had ended. Now the hive would administer the sentence. As I stepped into the corridor, I realized the order had not told me to die quickly. It had told me to die slowly, in installments, traded for minutes I would never see. I had thought my failure was running. I had thought my failure was cowardice. Now I understood my true failure had been surviving without paying. The vox clicked again, and the controller's voice became my new litany. Proceed to choke 1. You have 6 minutes. I began to walk. The hive did not have roads down here, not in the way a surface world did. It had arteries, transit tunnels, service spines, conveyor trenches, maintenance ladders that climbed into darkness. Each path was designed for something: workers, cargo, sewage, air, and none were designed for mercy. They took me along a route that had once been reserved for mechanized freight. The floor was a metal grate over a void where coolant pipes ran like veins. The walls were scarred with old impact marks and new graffiti prayers scratched by desperate hands. Some of the prayers were to the Emperor. Some were simply names, carved deep enough to outlast the person who wrote them. As we moved, I saw signs of evacuation, ration tins strewn in haste, a child's cloth doll trampled into oil, an overturned shrine candle still burning weakly on its side. The hive was trying to empty itself upward, like a lung trying to cough out poison. Above, somewhere beyond the ferrocrete layers, nobles would be sealing their habs and lighting incense in rooms with clean air. Down here, the air was already spent. The Arbeit sergeant did not escort me the whole way. At a junction marked by a faded Aquila and a new stencil reading Theta defense line, he handed me off to a pair of Astra Militarum troopers whose eyes were ringed with fatigue. They wore the same flak pattern as mine, but theirs still carried unit patches and the grime of comradeship. They looked at my restraint bands and the stamped sigils and understood what I was without asking. One of them made the sign of the Aquila, not toward me but toward the ceiling, as if appealing to something higher than this assignment. They walked me to Choke 1, the St. Helix Transit Arch. It had once been an elegant passage for mid-hive commuters, with curved plasteel ribs and lumen panels meant to suggest daylight. Now the lumens flickered, and the arch's decorative saints had been shot through, their faces broken. A barricade of stacked plastic crates and scrap metal blocked the tunnel, leaving firing slits. Sandbags lay split open, their filler spilling like grey guts. The smell here was sharp: ozone from last discharge, promethium from flamer bursts, and the copper tang of blood that had dried on the floor. Behind the barricade, a squad of defenders crouched. Their faces were masked, their eyes glassy. A heavy stubber sat on a tripod, its barrel smoking faintly. A Vox operator hunched over his set, hands trembling. When they saw me, Their expressions did not change. They had already accepted that men came and went. Only the line mattered. A sergeant with a scar down his cheek stepped forward. "Delay unit?" he asked, though it was not a question. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders. I nodded. He pointed to a position at the left flank where the barricade met a broken column. "You hold there. You fire until ordered to fall back. You do not run. If you run, I will shoot you and use your body as cover." He did not say it with cruelty. He said it with practicality, like a man discussing ammunition expenditure. I slid into position. The metal was cold against my back. Through the firing slit, I saw the tunnel beyond, dark, littered with debris. The far end glowing faintly, with emergency lumens that turned the air red. Shapes moved in that glow, not yet close enough to name. The defenders around me breathed in short, controlled bursts, as if the air itself was rationed. My vox clicked. "Choke 1. Hold," the controller said. 6 minutes. Time began to compress. In training, minutes were long. In war, minutes were bullets. The first wave came as a rush of shadows, then became men. Ragged figures in patchwork armor, some wearing hive gang colors, some wearing nothing but rags and stolen helmets. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open in screams that were swallowed by the tunnel's acoustics. They were not soldiers. They were hunger given rifles. The heavy stubber opened up, its roar filling the arch. Lasguns joined, red beams slicing through smoke. The tunnel filled with the smell of burned flesh and hot metal. I fired, my lasguns recoil familiar, comforting in its simplicity. Aim. Squeeze. Breathe. I watched a man spin as a beam took him in the chest. I watched another crawl forward on his elbows, dragging a knife between his teeth. A frag grenade burst, showering the tunnel with shrapnel that pinged off the archer's ribs like rain. I had expected fear to paralyze me. Instead, fear sharpened. The sentence had stripped away hope, and in the absence of hope, there was only function. I was not here to win. I was here to delay. That thought steadied my hands more than any prayer. A micro hook of sensation cut through the noise, the taste of ash on my tongue, the vibration of the stubber through the floor, the way my restraint band warmed slightly as its sigil plates absorbed heat. The hive itself seemed to lean closer, listening. The controller's voice returned. 4 minutes. The attackers pressed closer. A man with a crude flamer lurched forward, his weapon spitting a gout of promethium that splashed against the barricade. Flames crawled along the sandbags, eating the cheap fabric. Someone screamed as fire found flesh. The sergeant shouted a command, and a trooper with a fire suppressant canister sprayed foam, choking the flames. The air became thick with chemical stench. I fired until my pack's heat warning rune blinked. I swapped to my spare power pack and remembered the Arbeit sergeant's warning. Do not remove the sealed pack. The seal on my pack had a red wax stamp. Breaking it would be disobedience. I left it intact. I fought with the pack I was allowed to use, like a man allowed a certain amount of breath. 2 minutes, the controller said. The defenders began to shift. Crates were dragged, charges checked. The delay pattern required retreat, not rout. Retreat was an art the Astra Militarum rarely practiced well. It required discipline and timing. It required men to trust that falling back was not cowardice. It required men to trust that someone would hold the line behind them. In this pattern, that someone was always the condemned. A whistle blew. The sergeant leaned close to my firing slit. On the mark, he said. His eyes met mine for a heartbeat. There was no sympathy there, only acknowledgement. He knew what I was buying him. Seconds to pull his squad back without being overrun. The controller's voice came, again, colder now, as if she were reading from a chronometer. Fall back. Delay unit remains until final signal. The defenders began to withdraw in practiced bursts, covering each other. The heavy stubber was lifted and carried, its barrel still hot. The Vox operator was hauled up by his collar. The sergeant stayed until last, firing controlled bursts, then slapped my shoulder as he moved past. It was not encouragement, it was a transfer of responsibility. I remained, alone at the barricade's left flank, with the tunnel filling with screaming shapes. This was the first true taste of my sentence, to watch comrades retreat while I stayed, to feel the line thin until it was only my body. I fired into the oncoming mass. They were close enough now that I could see their faces, hive scum, militia deserters, men driven mad by whatever was pushing them forward. One wore a shrine collar, another had a child's toy tied to his belt. They came anyway. Behind them, deeper in the tunnel, heavier shapes moved, armored silhouettes, disciplined steps. The enemy's true strength approaching behind its thrown-away flesh. The detonator panel for the St. Helix Arch was mounted on the wall beside my position. It was a simple device, a lever protected by a plastic cover, a red rune plate stamped with the Aquila. The charge line ran into the arch's ribs, prepared to collapse the passage when triggered. Collapsing it would not stop the enemy forever. It would make them chew through rubble, slow them, redirect them into other corridors where other men would die. That was the hive's defense, a maze of sacrifices. The controller spoke. Trigger on my mark. 30 seconds. I kept firing, backing slowly toward the lever. My boots slid in blood and oil. The air was hot enough to sting my lungs. A man lunged through the slit, grabbing at my lasgun. I jammed the barrel into his throat and fired. His head snapped back, the beam punching through vertebrae. He fell, twitching, hands still reaching. 10 seconds, the controller said. I reached the lever. My fingers hovered. The lever was stiff, designed to prevent accidental activation. It felt like the hive itself resisting, as if the machine spirit disliked being wounded. I thought of the people above, climbing to safety, believing the Emperor's servants were holding the line. I thought of the Militarum clerk, tapping numbers onto a slate. I thought of the priest calling my death a duty shift. Mark, the controller said. I pulled. The world bucked. A deep boom rolled through the arch, and the ribs above me shuddered. Ferrocrete cracked. Dust exploded into the air like a grey storm. The St. Helix transit arch collapsed forward, not all at once, but in a grinding cascade, metal and stone screaming as it tore itself apart. I dove backward as the ceiling came down. A slab struck my shoulder, sending pain like fire through my arm. I rolled, coughing, my mouth filling with grit. Behind me, the passage became a wall of rubble. The screams on the other side turned muffled, then distant. For a moment, there was silence except for the settling debris and my own ragged breathing. The delay had been purchased. Minutes, perhaps. I lay on my back, staring up at a ceiling that still held, and felt my heart hammering like a drum in a chapel no priest would bless. The controller's voice returned, unwavering. Proceed to choke 2. You have 4 minutes. I pushed myself up, my shoulder screaming, and began to run, not away from death, but toward the next place where it would be demanded. Choke 2 was not a place meant for men. It was the Manufactorum vent spine, a service tunnel that ran like a narrow throat between coolant ducts and power conduits. The walls sweated oil. The floor was a mesh that vibrated with the heartbeat of machinery deeper in the hive. The air was hotter here, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and the sweet stink of overworked insulation. Every breath felt like drawing in heated wire. As I entered the spine, I saw the logic of delay pattern 9 with a clarity that made my skin prickle. The hive's defenders were not building walls, they were building time. Each choke point was positioned not for heroic last stands, but for calculated slowdowns, places where the enemy would be forced to funnel, to climb, to cut through, places where the environment itself could be turned into a weapon, places where a man could be left behind with a lever and an order. The corridor narrowed until my shoulders brushed the walls. Pipes ran overhead, marked with hazard runes and sanctified wax. A servitor hung from a ceiling rail, its augmetic arms fused to a welding rig, sparking as it patched a cracked conduit. Its face was a blank plate with a vox grill. As I passed, it turned its head, and emitted a burst of binaric cant, a machine prayer that sounded like a warning. I could not translate it, but I felt the meaning in my bones. Proceed, function, expire. At the far end of the vent spine, a hatch opened into a wider maintenance junction. Here, the defenders had built a second barricade, smaller, more desperate. A pair of sentry guns, ancient shrine-blessed turret mounts, tracked the corridor with whining servos. A tech adept knelt beside a control box, his robes tucked under his knees, his hands stained with unguents. He looked up as I approached, and his augmetic eye whirred, focusing. "Delay Unit Val," he said, reading my restraints like an inscription. Behind him, a squad of Astra Militarum troopers prepared to fall back. Their faces were pale under grime. One had a bandage soaked through with blood around his thigh. Another clutched a devotional icon in his fist, knuckles white. They did not ask my story. They did not need to. The stamped sigils on my wrists told them everything. This man is here to be used. The Militarum controller's voice came through my vox. Choke 2. Hold for 7 minutes. No charge detonation at this point. Primary function, fire delay. Secondary, seal hatch on withdrawal. The tech adept stood. His movements precise. He stepped close enough that I could smell the chemical sweetness of his unguents. "This junction is designated for controlled retreat," he said. "Hatch seal mechanism requires manual engagement." He gestured toward a heavy wheel on the far wall, connected to the hatch's locking bolts. "Engage, on signal. Failure to engage will result in immediate breach." Immediate breach meant the enemy would pour through into the maintenance junction, cutting off the defenders' retreat routes. It meant the delay pattern would collapse. It meant the time being bought would be stolen back. My sentence had become a keystone. Not because I was special, but because they had arranged the structure so that one expendable man could hold it long enough. The enemy reached us as a sound first, a distant roar of voices, boots, the clatter of weapons striking walls. Then came the smell, sweat, smoke, something acrid that made my eyes water. The first figures emerged in the vent spine's mouth, crawling over debris, moving low. These were not the screaming rabble from Choke 1. These were disciplined. They wore mismatched armor, but moved in coordinated bursts, covering each other. Their weapons were scavenged, but maintained. Their eyes were focused. The sentry guns opened fire, their barrels flashing, chewing into the tunnel mouth. Bodies fell, but the attackers kept coming, using their dead as cover. Lasfer stitched the junction, sparking off metal. A trooper beside me jerked as a shot took him in the neck. He fell without a sound, blood pumping in dark pulses. Another trooper dragged him back, hands slipping in gore, eyes wide with the shock of sudden loss. I fired into the vent spine, watching shots punch through armor and flesh. The narrow corridor turned into a slaughter channel. The attackers tried to push, but the geometry betrayed them. The hive's structure was my ally in this, even as it prepared to kill me later. I felt a grim gratitude toward the cold intelligence of architecture. Minutes passed in bursts of sensation, the heat from my lasgun's barrel, the sting of sweat in my eyes, the vibration of impacts through the floor mesh, the constant whine of the sentry gun's servos as they tracked targets. The tech adept moved among the control boxes, chanting binaric cant, his hands flickering over runes. Each time the sentry guns stuttered, he coaxed them back into function with unguents and prayer. At 3 minutes in, the enemy changed tactics. A pair of attackers rolled a crude shield forward, plating bolted to a frame, painted with defaced Imperial symbols. Behind it, they advanced, firing through slits. The sentry guns chewed at the shield, sparks flying, but it held long enough for grenades to be lobbed into the junction. One grenade bounced near my feet. I threw myself sideways as it detonated. The blast slammed my ribs, knocking the breath out of me. Shrapnel peppered my flak coat, embedding in the padding. Pain blossomed across my side like a bruise made of fire. I forced myself up, gasping. The defenders were already shifting backward, following the pattern. The Militarum controller's voice cut through the chaos. 4 minutes remaining. Maintain fire. Do not retreat beyond marker line. Marker line. A strip of yellow hazard paint across the floor. An arbitrary boundary that meant nothing to the enemy and everything to the pattern. I planted my boots on it and fired until the vent spine mouth was a haze of smoke and moving shadows. A micro hook of clarity struck me then. The Imperium's mathematics. Not the grand numbers in propaganda sermons, billions of soldiers, endless fleets, but the small arithmetic of this junction. If I held the line for 7 minutes, a squad would reach the next choke point with ammunition and wounded men intact. If I failed, the enemy would arrive seconds behind them, collapsing their defense before it formed. My life had become a variable in an equation. My death had become a unit of time. The idea should have made me angry. Instead, it made me calm. Anger requires a belief that things could be otherwise. The Imperium could not be otherwise. It was too large, too old, too hungry. It ate men and called it salvation. The controller spoke again. 1 minute. Prepare seal. The defenders began to withdraw through the hatch into a side corridor. The tech adept gestured to me, his augmetic eye gleaming. The wheel waited on the wall, heavy and cold. Sealing it would trap me on this side with the enemy. Sealing it would guarantee my isolation. It was the purest symbol of my sentence, to close the door behind my comrades and remain in the dark. The last trooper limped through, his bandaged thigh leaving smears of blood on the floor. He looked back once, eyes meeting mine. There was no spoken farewell, only a flicker of something like shame, because he would live longer, because I would not. Then, he disappeared into the hatchway. The controller's voice became a counting clock. 10 seconds. I fired until my pack's indicator blinked low. I felt the temptation to break the seal on the Militarum stamped pack, to grab forbidden extra shots. Disobedience for survival. The thought came like a whisper from my earlier self, the self who had crawled away from a collapsing tunnel. I crushed it. If I broke the seal, I would be stealing time from the Imperium. The idea was obscene. Mark, the controller said. I ran to the wheel. It took both hands. I turned, muscles straining, the metal scraping under my palms. The locking bolts clanked into place. The hatch began to close, sliding with a heavy groan. Through the narrowing gap, I saw the tech adept raise his hand in a gesture that might have been blessing, or simply confirmation of completed function. The hatch sealed with a final clang. A red rune lit on the control box, locked. Silence fell for a heartbeat, as if the hive itself inhaled. Then the enemy hit the junction like a wave. They poured from the vent spine, climbing over their dead, firing as they came. Without the defenders supporting fire, the sentry guns became my only allies. They rattled, barrels glowing. One turret was struck by a grenade and exploded in a spray of metal. The other continued firing until its ammunition feed jammed, and then it clicked uselessly, its servos whining in frustration. I was alone. I backed toward the far wall, firing controlled bursts, using the junction's machinery as cover. A shot struck my shoulder, the same one already bruised from choke 1, sending pain down my arm. I bit back a cry. The world narrowed to targets and breathing. The attackers advanced with brutal efficiency now that they had me isolated. They were not trying to overrun a line. They were trying to kill one man. And in that moment, I understood why the pattern required consent. Not because they respected my will, but because they needed the particular kind of obedience that comes from a man who has accepted he is already dead. A man who is already dead does not panic. He does not run. He becomes part of the hive's mechanism. The controller's voice came through, calm as ever. Proceed to choke 3. You have 3 minutes. Proceed. The word was absurd amid chaos, but the hive had roots even for the condemned. A maintenance ladder in the junction led upward into a narrow shaft. It was marked with hazard runes and a small aquila. The escape path. The next stage. I fired one last burst to clear space, then grabbed the ladder and climbed, my boots slipping on oily rungs. Shots sparked against the metal around me. A hand grabbed my ankle. I kicked down hard, feeling bone give. The hand released. I climbed faster, lungs burning, sweat stinging my eyes. Above, a hatch waited. I slammed it open and rolled through into darkness. As I lay there, breathing hard, I realized I had not been ordered to die in one place. I had been ordered to be dying everywhere, a moving wound that the enemy had to keep reopening. That was the Imperium's genius and its cruelty, to make even a coward's survival useful by turning it into a series of controlled sacrifices. Choke 3 was a shrine that had forgotten how to pray. They called it the Shrine of the 49th Martyr, but it was nothing like the high chapels of my childhood stories. It was a maintenance vault converted into devotion by desperate hands. Pipes ran along the ceiling like ribs. The walls were covered in icon scraps, printed saints, torn hymn pages, scraps of cloth dipped in blood and pinned with nails. Candles burned in alcoves cut into the metal, their wax dripping onto the floor in thick pale tears. The air was thick with incense and the sour smell of old smoke, as if faith could be used to fumigate terror. In the center of the shrine stood a statue made of welded scrap, shaped vaguely like a man with arms spread. A helmet had been bolted where the head should be. A lasgun barrel formed the spine. At its feet lay offerings, ration tins, spent casings, a child's ribbon, a broken cog. The hive's poor had built their martyr from what they had, because the Imperium rarely gave them more. A squad waited here, what remained of one. 4 troopers and a commissar, their uniforms blackened with soot. The commissar's coat was torn at the hem, his cap missing. He held a bolt pistol in one hand and a data slate in the other, as if execution and accounting were the same duty. His eyes fixed on my restraint bands. He did not ask who I was. He read what I was. "Delay Unit Val," he said, voice steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from a man who has executed friends without flinching. "You are late." "I am here," I answered. The words felt inadequate. He gestured toward a barricade built across the shrine's entrance, a low wall of pew fragments and scrap. Behind it, a demolition console was set into the floor. Wires ran from it into the shrine's foundation, into sanctified charge lines embedded in the walls. This was not a simple collapse lever. This was a sanctum prepared to become a tomb. The Militarum controller spoke through my vox. Choke 3. Hold for 8 minutes. On withdrawal, delay unit will remain to initiate final seal sequence. Commissariat oversight confirmed. Commissariat oversight. The commissar's presence was not for morale. It was for certainty. They had learned from men like me that fear could make even the condemned attempt to bargain. The commissar existed to prevent bargaining. The enemy's approach was audible now, closer than before. The shrine's candles flickered with each distant impact, their flames bending as if bowing. The troopers around me checked their ammunition, their hands moving with the slow precision of men who knew they were near the end of their usefulness. One of them pressed his forehead to the scrap martyr statue and held it there for a heartbeat. Then he moved back to the barricade without a word. The commissar stepped close enough that I could smell his sweat under the scent of incense. "You understand your duty?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded once. "Good. Redemption is not granted, but it can be earned in fragments." Fragments. Minutes. Seconds. Everything reduced to pieces. The enemy hit the shrine entrance like a hammer. Lasfire flashed through the doorway. The defenders returned fire, red beams cutting through incense smoke. The shrine filled with the sharp smell of ozone and burned cloth. The scrap martyr statue loomed in the candlelight, its welded arms casting long shadows that looked like wings. I took position at the barricade's left side again, as if the pattern had branded that role into me. I fired into the doorway, watching attackers fall. These were harder now. Armored figures with disciplined movement, advancing under covering fire. Behind them, I glimpsed heavier shapes, men in heavier plates, carrying crude breaching tools. The enemy was adapting, learning the hive's delay geometry. A micro hook of sensation struck as a round ricocheted off a pipe and showered sparks onto the candles, making them flare. The shrine smelled briefly of burning wax and hot metal, like a forge trying to become a church. Minutes burned. The defenders' fire slowed as ammunition dwindled. The commissar moved among us, not shouting litanies, simply existing as a threat and a symbol. A trooper beside me was hit in the chest, his flak coat shredding. He fell backward into the candles, knocking them over. Wax spilled onto his face. He did not scream. He stared up at the ceiling, eyes wide, lips moving in silent prayer, and then he stopped moving. The candles continued burning around his body, indifferent. The controller's voice came. 3 minutes. Prepare withdrawal. Withdrawal. The defenders began to fall back deeper into the shrine, toward a rear hatch that led to the final seal vault. The demolition console's runes glowed faintly, waiting. The commissar tapped his data slate, confirming timing, his eyes never leaving the doorway. The enemy surged forward, sensing retreat. Their fire intensified. A breaching charge detonated at the doorway, blasting the barricade with shrapnel. A trooper's arm was torn off. Blood sprayed the shrine wall, painting over saint images. He collapsed, screaming now, and another trooper dragged him, leaving a smear of red across the floor like a trail. 1 minute, the controller said. The commissar looked at me. His gaze was not cruel, it was clinical. You will remain, he said. It was not an order that needed to be spoken, it was already written in the pattern. But he spoke it anyway, because words have power in the Imperium when written on vellum or spoken by authority. You will initiate final seal. You will hold until the charge sequence completes. You will not attempt to follow. I felt my throat tighten. Not from fear of death, I had been walking toward death for hours, but from the finality of isolation. The earlier seals had trapped me behind doors that might have been reopened. This one would be absolute, a vault designed to close and never open again. A man left behind like a component fused into place. The defenders withdrew through the rear hatch. The wounded trooper was hauled out, still screaming. The last uninjured trooper paused at the threshold, turned, and made the sign of the Aquila toward me, his fingers trembling. Then he disappeared, and the hatch began to close. The commissar stayed with me. He did not leave. That surprised me more than anything. His duty could have ended with ensuring I remained. Instead, he stood at my side as the hatch sealed. When it closed, we were together in the shrine, 2 men and a scrap martyr, facing the enemy's approach. Why stay? I asked before I could stop myself. He did not answer immediately. He watched the doorway, bolt pistol raised. Because, he said at last, if you falter, the hive dies, quicker. And if I am here, you will not falter. It was the closest thing to companionship I had been offered since my arrest, and it was offered as a threat. Still, it warmed something in my chest that had been cold for a long time. The enemy poured into the shrine, shouting, firing, their boots crunching on broken pew wood. The candles were knocked over, flames licking at scraps of cloth and paper prayers. The scrap martyr statue was struck by rounds, sparks flying from welded seams. The shrine began to burn. I fired until my pack ran low, swapping to my last spare. I felt the sealed Militarum pack against my hip, heavy with forbidden capacity. The temptation returned, stronger now. Break the seal. Use the extra shots. Live longer. Maybe reach the hatch before it fully seals. Maybe claw at the mechanism. Maybe. The commissar's bolt pistol barked, and an attacker's head exploded in a spray of gore. The sound snapped me back. The commissar was watching the doorway, not me, but I felt his presence like a chain around my will. I realized then my self-sabotage would not be running. It would be something quieter, something more loyal and more damning. The demolition console sat in the floor near the scrap martyr. Its runes glowed brighter as enemy bodies pressed closer. The controller's voice came, calm as ever. Initiate final seal sequence. Delay unit authorized. 8 minutes to completion. 8 minutes. 8 minutes of holding while charge is armed, while blast doors sealed, while the hive rerouted power and locked sanctums. 8 minutes that would determine whether thousands above lived long enough to be evacuated. 8 minutes that would be purchased by whatever remained of me and the commissar. I knelt at the console. It had a cover plate stamped with the Aquila. Under it were runes and a large activation stud. Above the stud, etched in high Gothic, were words, "The Emperor protects the faithful who complete their function." I placed my hand over the stud and felt the warmth of the circuitry beneath. The machine spirit waited. A micro hook of stillness cut through the chaos. My fingers on cold metal, incense smoke mixing with cordite, the sound of my own breathing louder than the gunfire for a heartbeat. I pressed the stud. The console emitted a low hum that rose in pitch. Warning runes lit around the shrine, red and pulsing. Somewhere in the hive's depths, mechanisms engaged, blast doors sliding, locks clanking, machinery shifting. The final seal had begun. The enemy saw the lights and surged, as if drawn to the idea of being denied. They rushed the console. I rose and fired point blank, my lascan's beam burning holes in flesh. The commissar stepped forward, bolt pistol barking, each shot a thunderclap. He was magnificent in that moment, not because he was heroic, but because he was pure function embodied. His coat flared as he moved, his face set in grim calm. Minutes crawled. The shrine burned hotter. Smoke thickened, making my lungs ache. My shots became fewer, more deliberate. The enemy pressed closer, stepping over their dead, driven by rage or desperation. A blade flashed, cutting my forearm. Pain flared, hot and sharp. Blood ran down my hand, slicking my grip. The controller's voice, 5 minutes. The commissar was hit in the shoulder, his coat tore, blood blooming dark. He staggered, but did not fall. He fired again, jaw clenched, eyes bright with stubbornness. Hold. He breathed, not into vox, not as speech, but as a sound torn from his chest. The controller's voice, 3 minutes. My lasgun clicked empty. I swapped packs with shaking hands. The sealed Militarum pack remained untouched. I could have used it now. I could have doubled my fire. I could have held longer. I could have made my death less certain. Instead, I did what my sentence demanded in its purest form. I left power unused because it was not assigned. I denied myself even the illusion of choice. The controller's voice, 2 minutes. The commissar's bolt pistol ran low. He drew his chainsword, an old thing, teeth worn, sanctified with prayer strips. It roared to life, its sound a mechanical scream that drowned the enemy's shouts. He waded into them, not for glory, but to keep them off the console. Blood sprayed, mixing with candle wax, making the shrine floor slick. I fired until my last pack was nearly empty. My arm bled. My ribs ached. My shoulder throbbed. The air was smoke and heat. The scrap martyr statue stood amid flames, its welded arms blackening, as if it too were being sacrificed. The controller's voice, 1 minute. The commissar's chainsword sputtered as it bit into a breaching shield. An enemy blade plunged into his side. He grunted, teeth bared, and drove the chainsword deeper, pulling the attacker with him. He did not fall. He leaned into his own wound like a man leaning into duty. I backed toward the console again, guarding it with my body. I realized then the self-sabotage beat I had chosen, not breaking the seal, not stealing extra shots, not attempting escape. I was proving my loyalty not by dying, but by refusing even the tools that might make me last. I was buying time the way the Imperium demanded, without bargaining. The controller's voice became a final count. 10. The shrine shook as distant blast doors locked. The hum of the console rose, almost singing. 9. The enemy surged one last time, sensing something ending. 8. My lasgun pack beeped empty again. I dropped the weapon and drew my combat knife. 7. The commissar finally fell to one knee, blood pouring, his chainsword still spun weakly. 6. A fist struck my face, knocking me sideways. I tasted blood. 5. I stabbed upward, felt the knife hit ribs, twist. 4. The console's runes flared bright enough to hurt my eyes. 3. The shrine's ceiling groaned, as if the hive itself was bracing. 2. The enemy's shouts turned to confusion, anger, fear. 1. The final seal completed. The sound that followed was not an explosion, not immediately. It was a change in the hive's voice, a deep settling, like a giant machine exhaling after locking its jaw. The shrine's warning runes went from pulsing red to steady amber. The console's hum dropped into a low, steady tone that felt like a heartbeat under my feet. Somewhere beyond the sealed hatch, far above, men and women would be moving through corridors with a little more space behind them, a little more time before pursuit found them. The enemy hesitated, not because they understood the pattern, but because the environment had shifted. Vents hissed. Air pressure changed. A blast door somewhere slammed shut with a distant clang that reverberated through the shrine's bones. The hive was closing itself like a fist. I crawled toward the scrap martyr statue, dragging myself through wax and blood. My vision blurred at the edges. The smoke made the world swim. The flames had climbed the wall prayers, turning hymn pages into curling black petals. The statue's welded arms were glowing faintly with heat, and the helmet bolted where its head should be stared down at me with an empty visor. The commissar lay near the doorway, half on his side, one hand still gripping his chainsword's handle. The weapon had died, its teeth still. His chest rose and fell in shallow, stubborn breaths. His eyes found mine. In them I saw not regret, not fear, but the cold satisfaction of a completed order. The vox in my ear clicked. The Militarum controller's voice came one last time, softer now, as if the hive's sealed geometry muffled it. Final seal complete. Delay unit Val. Function acknowledged. She paused, and in that pause I heard something almost human. Fatigue, perhaps. Remain in position. Retrieval is not authorized. Not authorized. The phrase was cleaner than any goodbye. It meant no one was coming. It meant the sealed doors were not meant to open, because opening them would spend the time we had purchased. The Imperium did not waste its own payments. The enemy began to move again, slower now, probing. They fired into the shrine, testing, angry. One of them shouted something, words I could not make out through smoke and ringing ears. Another threw a grenade that clattered across the floor and rolled to a stop against the scrap martyr statue. It did not detonate. Perhaps it was a dud. Perhaps the hive's shifting pressure had damaged it. Perhaps the Emperor had spared a grenade's mercy, only to deny a man's. I laughed once, a dry sound that turned into a cough. Blood speckled the floor. The commissar watched me, and his mouth moved. I leaned closer, hearing only the crackle of flames and the distant grind of sealed mechanisms. "Do you repent?" He breathed, the words barely audible. I thought of the tunnel collapse, the darkness, my crawling hands. I thought of the vellum, the ink, the word delay unit. I thought of holding lines while others retreated, sealing hatches with my own hands. I thought of refusing the sealed power pack like it was a temptation from weakness. "I pay," I answered. The commissar's eyes closed. His chest rose once more, then stilled, as if his body had finally received permission to stop. The shrine continued burning. The air grew thicker. My lungs worked harder, each breath a rasp. The enemy's shapes blurred through smoke. I could have crawled toward them with my knife. I could have tried to take one more with me. I could have made my death loud. But the pattern had never asked for loud. It had asked for time. Time had been delivered. Now silence was the only honest offering left. I reached into my flak coat and touched the sealed Militarum power pack. The wax stamp was intact. It felt warm from the shrine's heat, heavy with unused potential. For a moment, I imagined breaking it now, firing into smoke until the last breath left me. A final refusal to be efficient. A final insistence that I was more than a variable. I left it sealed. I lay on my back beneath the scrap martyr's shadow, watching candle flames gutter into smoke. The hive's distant machinery hummed steady, indifferent, like a prayer that did not need a voice to be true. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of red and black, and in that narrowing I felt something like peace. Not forgiveness, not salvation, but the relief of a debt finally accounted for. I was sentenced to live, just long enough to fail properly, and then properly end.